The HOA president stood in the middle of my grandmother's lakefront property and pointed directly at my 82-year-old grandfather. "Arrest him!" she yelled. "He's trespassing!" Half the neighborhood was watching. Phones were recording. A sheriff's cruiser sat in the driveway while HOA board members stood behind Brenda Kensington with smug smiles on their faces. My grandfather didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked out across the lake for a moment, the same lake where he'd spent 50 summers fishing with my grandmother before she passed away. Then he reached into his truck and pulled out an old leather folder. At first, nobody paid much attention. Then the sheriff saw the documents inside. His expression changed instantly. The crowd went silent. Brenda stopped talking, and the sheriff asked a question that made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Kensington," he said slowly, "do you have any idea who this man is and how much trouble you've just caused yourself?" Before I tell you how a simple HOA complaint turned into a county investigation, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, here's how all of this started. 6 months before the sheriff showed up at my cabin, I inherited 5 acres of lakefront property from my grandmother. The cabin sat on the eastern shore of Cedar Ridge Lake in northern Michigan. It wasn't luxurious. The roof needed work. The dock leaned slightly after every hard winter. The boathouse looked like it had survived 3 different decades by pure stubbornness, but it was home. My grandparents bought the property more than 50 years earlier, long before any HOA existed. Every corner of that land carried memories. Family cookouts, fishing trips, summer evenings spent watching the sunset over the water. After my grandmother passed away, the place became even more important, especially to my grandfather. Arthur Mitchell had spent 54 years married to her. Losing her changed him in ways he rarely talked about. The cabin was one of the few places where he still seemed at peace. So when he asked if he could stay with me for a while, I didn't hesitate. For the next few weeks, life was simple. We repaired sections of the dock. We fished almost every evening. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch drinking coffee while Grandpa told stories about the early days of the property. For the first time in a long time, things felt normal. Then Brenda Kensington decided to get involved. I'd dealt with her before. Everyone in Cedar Ridge Estates had. As HOA president, Brenda treated every rule like federal law and every homeowner like a potential criminal. Most people avoided arguing with her because it simply wasn't worth the headache. Unfortunately, my grandfather never got that memo. One Tuesday morning, I walked outside and found Brenda standing near the dock with a clipboard in her hands. Grandpa sat calmly in a folding chair beside the water. Brenda looked furious. Grandpa looked entertained. "Mr. Mitchell," she said sharply, "according to HOA records, you've been living here for 23 days without board approval." Grandpa slowly lowered his fishing rod. "Is that so?" "It is." "And why exactly is that your business?" I almost smiled. Brenda didn't. She opened a folder and pulled out several papers. Then she handed me an envelope. Inside was an official HOA notice demanding that my 82-year-old grandfather leave the property within 72 hours. And if he didn't, the HOA would begin legal enforcement action. I looked at Grandpa, expecting anger. Instead, he smiled. The kind of smile a man gives when someone has just made a mistake they don't understand yet. And somehow, that worried me more than the notice itself. At first, I thought the notice was just another HOA power trip, annoying, ridiculous, but ultimately harmless. I was wrong. Over the next few days, Brenda made it clear she wasn't bluffing. Every morning seemed to bring a new problem. One day it was photographs. The next day it was measurements. Then came the orange survey flags. I came home from the grocery store and found bright markers running along the gravel lane beside the cabin. The same lane my grandparents had used for decades. The same lane that led to the old boathouse and dock. I pulled one of the flags out of the ground. The next morning, 3 more appeared. That evening, my neighbor Tom stopped by. He pointed toward the road. "You got company." Brenda's SUV sat near the entrance to my property. 2 HOA board members stood beside her holding clipboards. One was taking pictures, The other appeared to be measuring the width of the lane. I walked over immediately. "What exactly are you doing?" Brenda didn't even look embarrassed. "We're conducting a property review." "On my land?" "That remains to be determined." I stared at her. "My family has owned this property since before the HOA existed." "That's your opinion." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Meanwhile, Grandpa remained strangely calm, almost too calm. That night I found him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by old documents, property records, county maps, survey copies, notes written in my grandmother's handwriting. He looked like a man searching for something specific. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "Just looking through old records." "For what?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Insurance." I knew that wasn't the real answer, but I let it go. The next morning, things escalated again. This time, Brenda arrived with contractors. 3 trucks pulled into the gravel lane shortly after breakfast. Workers began unloading steel posts and sections of fencing. My stomach dropped. I walked outside. "What is this?" Brenda smiled. "The board has approved a temporary access gate." A gate, until ownership questions are resolved. The workers started marking locations for fence posts. One of them actually spray-painted part of the gravel lane. Watching it happen felt surreal, like someone slowly trying to take my property one piece at a time. For the first time since this began, I saw genuine concern on Grandpa's face. Not panic, concern. He walked over to the lane and studied an old rusted survey marker hidden near the tree line. Then he frowned. Something wasn't right. That evening, after the contractors left, he spread every document he had across the dining room table. Hours passed, midnight came and went. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since Brenda appeared, he looked frustrated. I felt my stomach tighten. "What is it?" He rubbed his forehead. "There's supposed to be another map." "What kind of map?" "The one that proves exactly what that lane is." I stared at him. "You can't find it." Slowly, he shook his head. Outside, the half-finished gate stood in the darkness. Inside, the one document we desperately needed had somehow disappeared. And unless we found it soon, Brenda might actually get away with this. I barely slept that night. The image of that half-finished gate kept replaying in my head. Every time I looked out the window, I could see it sitting there under the security lights like a monument to everything that was wrong with this situation. Meanwhile, my grandfather stayed at the dining room table, hour after hour, searching, reading, checking old records. The missing map had become an obsession, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. Without it, Brenda had just enough uncertainty to keep pushing forward. The next morning, I woke up to find Grandpa asleep in a chair. For the first time since he'd arrived at the cabin, he looked every bit of his 82 years. His reading glasses were still on. Papers covered the table. A photograph of Grandma sat beside him. Something about that scene hit me hard. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was a man fighting to protect one of the last places that still connected him to the woman he'd loved for more than half a century. Later that afternoon, I started cleaning out an old storage closet, mostly to keep my mind busy. The cabin was full of boxes nobody had touched in years. Fishing gear, photo albums, old family records, things Grandma never threw away. About an hour into it, I found a dusty cardboard box labeled Lake House Memories. I almost ignored it. Then I noticed Grandpa's handwriting on the side. Curious, I carried it into the living room. Inside were dozens of photo albums, old letters, greeting cards, and stacks of photographs dating back decades. When Grandpa saw the box, he immediately stood up. His eyes widened. "I haven't seen that in years." Together, we started sorting through everything. For nearly an hour, we found nothing useful. Just memories, pictures of family cookouts, fishing tournaments, Christmas gatherings. Then I opened a photo album from the late 1980s. Something slipped from between the pages. A folded envelope, yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front belonged to my grandmother. Arthur, in case you ever need it. My grandfather froze. Carefully, he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, and behind the letter, another folded document, much larger, much older. My heart immediately started racing. Grandpa unfolded it slowly. Neither of us spoke. The room felt completely silent. Then I saw the county seal, survey markings, property boundaries, official signatures, the missing map. For several seconds, Grandpa simply stared at it, not smiling, not celebrating, just staring. Then he laughed. A small, tired laugh. Your grandmother. What? He shook his head. She always hid important things where nobody would think to look. For the first time in days, genuine relief washed across his face. The map clearly showed the gravel lane, the easement boundaries, the county access route, everything. Every question Brenda had been exploiting suddenly had an answer, but the biggest surprise wasn't the map. It was the note attached to it. At the bottom of the letter, my grandmother had written, "If anyone ever challenges ownership of this property, show them this map first and ask questions later." That sounded exactly like her. Grandpa carefully folded the document, then reached for the phone. "Who are you calling?" I asked. He smiled. "Someone who needs to see this." The next morning, 3 county vehicles pulled into my driveway, and suddenly, Brenda Kensington's very bad week was about to become much worse. The next morning, Cedar Ridge woke up to an unusual sight. 3 county vehicles were parked in my driveway. By 9 o'clock, half the neighborhood knew about it. By 10, people were gathering near the road, and by 11, Brenda Kensington came flying down the street like her hair was on fire. The moment she stepped out of her SUV, she headed straight toward Patricia Wong from County Code Enforcement. "What is going on?" Patricia didn't even look up from the documents she was reviewing. "We're verifying county records. You can't conduct inspections without notifying the HOA." Patricia calmly handed her a copy of the survey map. "You may want to read this." Brenda snatched the paper. For a few seconds, she stared at it. Then her expression changed. Not completely, but enough. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. The county survey team spent most of the afternoon taking measurements, checking markers, comparing maps, reviewing easement records. Meanwhile, homeowners continued gathering nearby. Nobody wanted to miss the show. Tom brought lawn chairs. Someone else brought coffee. At one point, it looked more like a community event than an investigation. Then, the lead surveyor finally approached Patricia. Everyone went quiet, even Brenda. The surveyor pointed toward the gravel lane beside my cabin. "The easement is confirmed." A ripple moved through the crowd. Brenda immediately stepped forward. "That's impossible." The surveyor shrugged. "The measurements match the original county records exactly." He then pointed toward the partially completed gate. "The HOA installation obstructs a recorded emergency access route." The silence that followed was almost painful, because everyone understood what that meant. The gate project wasn't just wrong. It could create liability for the HOA, potentially very expensive liability. Patricia turned toward Brenda. "The gate needs to be removed." Brenda's face turned bright red. "No." The single word shocked everyone, including me. Patricia blinked. "I'm sorry." I said no. The crowd exchanged looks. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors anymore. This was an HOA president openly arguing with county officials, and it wasn't going well. Patricia's tone became noticeably firmer. "Mrs. Kensington, this isn't optional." For a moment, it looked like Brenda might keep fighting. Then another vehicle arrived. A sheriff's cruiser. The moment it pulled into the driveway, the atmosphere changed. Sheriff Frank Collins stepped out and walked directly toward my grandfather. Not toward Patricia, not toward Brenda, toward Arthur. "Good to see you again," he said. Grandpa smiled. "You too, Frank." The crowd immediately started whispering. People noticed, especially Brenda. The look on her face was priceless. Until that moment, she'd been treating my grandfather like an old man who didn't understand HOA rules. Now she was watching county officials and the sheriff greet him like an old friend, and suddenly, her confidence seemed a lot smaller. Then things got even worse for her. Patricia received a phone call. She listened quietly for nearly a minute. When she hung up, her expression became serious. Very serious. She walked toward Brenda. "Mrs. Kensington, we also need access to HOA financial records." Brenda froze. The crowd did too. Financial records. It wasn't about a gate. That wasn't about property lines. That was something entirely different. Something bigger. And judging by the panic that flashed across Brenda's face, she knew exactly what they might find. The moment Patricia mentioned HOA financial records, everything changed. Up until then, most homeowners thought this was still about the gate, the easement, my grandfather, a simple property dispute, but financial records, that was different. You could see it in the crowd's reaction. People stopped talking, stopped whispering, stopped recording, because suddenly everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why did the county care about HOA money? Brenda looked like she wanted to leave. Unfortunately for her, things were only getting started. Patricia spent the next few days reviewing documents, and the more records she examined, the more questions appeared. Questions about contractor payments, questions about enforcement fines, questions about surveillance equipment, questions about expenses nobody seemed able to explain. Meanwhile, homeowners started coming forward, one after another. A retired teacher brought copies of violation notices. A widower brought years of correspondence with the HOA. Another homeowner brought invoices showing thousands of dollars in fines he'd paid simply because he didn't know how to challenge them. The pile kept growing, and every new document made Brenda's situation worse. 3 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. Mandatory attendance. The entire community was invited. Everyone knew something big was coming. The clubhouse parking lot was already full when Grandpa and I arrived. People lined the sidewalks. Others stood outside talking in small groups. Nobody seemed interested in HOA business anymore. They wanted answers. Inside, the room was packed. Brenda sat at the front table with the remaining board members. She looked exhausted. Gone was the confident woman who had threatened to evict my grandfather. Gone was the woman who thought she could put a gate across family property. Now she looked nervous, and for the first time, alone. The meeting started exactly at 7. Patricia introduced representatives from the county attorney's office. The room immediately went silent. Then, the findings began. Improper enforcement actions, invalid fines, questionable expenditures, unapproved surveillance purchases. Every statement felt heavier than the last. Several homeowners became emotional. One woman admitted she'd paid thousands of dollars in fines because she believed she had no choice. Another homeowner said he stopped attending meetings years earlier because he felt intimidated by the board. The stories kept coming. Then came the final report. The county attorney stood and looked around the room. "Our review recommends immediate leadership changes and a full financial audit." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence was absolute. Then he placed a resignation agreement in front of Brenda. The entire room watched. Slowly, she looked up. Her eyes briefly met my grandfather's. Arthur didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He simply sat there quietly, the same way he had from the beginning. A few seconds later, Brenda signed, just like that. It was over. Months later, the gate was gone. The fines were overturned. The HOA was reorganized, and several homeowners received reimbursement checks. One evening, Grandpa and I sat on the dock watching the sunset over Cedar Ridge Lake, the same place where he and Grandma had spent so many summers together. After a long silence, I asked him if all the stress had been worth it. He looked out across the water and smiled. It wasn't about winning. What was it about? He thought for a moment, then gave the answer I'll never forget. It was about making sure the truth stayed longer than the lie. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I realized he was right. Because in the end, the HOA lost its power the moment people stopped being afraid of it. One lesson this story reminds us of is that truth doesn't always win quickly, but it has a way of lasting longer than fear, intimidation, and borrowed authority. Too often, people stay silent because they think they can't fight back against someone with a title, a position, or a little power. But real strength isn't about being loud or aggressive. It's about staying calm, standing by your principles, and refusing to give up when something is wrong. Arthur never tried to overpower anyone. He simply trusted the facts, protected what mattered to him, and stayed patient long enough for the truth to come to light. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is keep your integrity when others are losing theirs. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in this situation, what would you have done? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who abused their authority? Share your story in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and your experiences often inspire future videos. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next HOA revenge story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.